After 170 years, through floods that swallowed entire towns, through wars that tore the nation in half, through decades of neglect and abandonment, the Brazos River Bridge refuses to fall. Engineers who examine it today speak in hushed tones about its construction, the precision of its stone arches, the mathematical perfection of its load distribution. The ingenious water management system that channels floodwaters away from its foundations. They call it a marvel of 19th-century engineering. They write papers about its anonymous builder, but the bridge wasn't always anonymous. In 1849, when it opened to great celebration in Robertson County, Texas, the newspapers credited its construction to Colonel Edmund Pierce, a wealthy plantation owner with no engineering training whatsoever. Pierce accepted the accolades with characteristic confidence. He shook hands with the governor. He gave speeches about American ingenuity and manifest destiny. He collected the substantial payment from the state legislature. He never once mentioned the man who actually designed it. That man's name was written in the plantation ledgers as property. His value was listed at $1,200, less than the cost of 3 good horses. His sleeping quarters measured 6 ft by 8 ft. His meals consisted of cornmeal, salt pork, and whatever vegetables he could grow in the small plot behind the quarters. His hands bore the calluses of 20 years of forced labor, but his mind held secrets that would take another century to fully understand. This is the story of how genius can be buried, how history can be erased, and how the very foundations of American infrastructure rest on truths that were deliberately hidden. This is the story of Isaac Brown, and of the terrible price he paid for possessing knowledge that others could only steal. Before we continue with the story of Isaac Brown and the bridge that should have made him famous, I need you to do something. If you're interested in hearing more untold stories like this, stories that history tried to erase, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I want to know, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these forgotten histories can reach. To understand what happened to Isaac Brown, we need to understand the world he was born into. A world where a man could be both indispensable and invisible. Texas in the 1840s existed in a state of violent transformation. Annexed by the United States just 3 years after winning independence from Mexico, it was a place where fortunes could be made or lost in a single season, where the line between civilization and wilderness remained dangerously thin. Robertson County, situated in the fertile bottomlands between the Brazos and Trinity Rivers, represented everything that wealthy Southern planters dreamed of. Rich soil, abundant water, and enough distance from established society that questions about property acquisition and labor practices could be politely ignored. Colonel Edmund Pierce had arrived in Texas in 1836 with family money from Georgia, 3 wagons full of furniture, and 11 enslaved people. By 1848, he owned 4,000 acres and 63 souls. He grew cotton primarily, but his real wealth came from something more unusual: contracts. The Republic of Texas and later the state desperately needed infrastructure. Roads had to be cut through forests, rivers had to be forded or bridged, towns needed wells, drainage systems, foundations for public buildings. Pierce had a talent for securing these contracts through a combination of family connections, strategic donations to political campaigns, and an impressive ability to submit winning bids that somehow always came in just under the competition. What made Pierce's success particularly remarkable was that he had no background in engineering or construction. His education consisted of 2 years at a mediocre college in Savannah, where he'd studied literature and philosophy before dropping out to manage his family's holdings. He couldn't read architectural plans. He barely understood basic mathematics beyond simple accounting. Yet projects bearing his name were completed with unusual speed and exceptional quality. Roads that should have washed out in the first heavy rain lasted for years. Buildings rose with perfect level and plumb, and the structures were always delivered ahead of schedule, allowing Pierce to move on to the next lucrative contract. The secret to Pierce's success lived in the smallest cabin on his property, a structure set slightly apart from the other slave quarters. It measured just 8 ft by 10 ft with a dirt floor, no windows, and a door that locked from the outside. Inside that cabin, by the light of tallow candles that Isaac Brown had to make himself, some of the finest engineering work in Texas was being produced. Isaac Brown had been born in 1808 on a tobacco plantation in Virginia. His mother, whose name was recorded only as Ruth in the plantation records, had been a house slave who could read, an illegal skill she'd learned from the plantation owner's daughter, who taught Ruth in secret during their childhood friendship. When that daughter married and moved north, becoming an abolitionist in the process, she tried to purchase Ruth's freedom. The plantation owner refused. Ruth passed her literacy to Isaac in whispered lessons after the day's work was done. But she gave him something else, too, a hunger to understand how things worked. Why did some buildings stand for generations while others collapsed in storms? Why did certain bridges wash away while others held firm? Why did water flow where it did, and how could you control it? When Isaac was 16, his owner sold him to a railroad company to help clear land for track. The experience changed his life. For 2 years, he worked alongside Irish and German immigrants who'd been hired as engineers and surveyors. Unlike the plantation, where slaves were forbidden from learning anything beyond their assigned tasks, the railroad camp operated under different rules. They needed workers who could understand instructions, read measurements, follow plans. Isaac absorbed everything. He watched the surveyors plot grades with their transits and chains. He observed how engineers calculated loads and stresses. He studied the way experienced builders read the land, understanding where water would collect, where soil would shift, where foundations needed to be reinforced. He asked questions when he could, listened intently when he couldn't, and spent his few free hours sketching diagrams in the dirt with sticks, working through problems in his head. The railroad engineer, a German immigrant named Heinrich Weber, noticed Isaac's aptitude. Weber was an idealistic man, troubled by slavery, but practical enough to know he couldn't change the system alone. What he could do was teach. Over those 2 years, Weber gave Isaac something precious, the foundational knowledge of engineering. He loaned Isaac books explaining that if anyone asked, Isaac was just carrying them. He showed Isaac how to calculate using logarithmic tables. He taught him about materials, the properties of different stones, the behavior of wood under various conditions, the crucial importance of proper drainage. The best engineers, Weber told Isaac one evening as they reviewed plans for a trestle bridge, they don't just build for today, they build for 100 years from now. They think about every force, every stress, every way nature will try to reclaim what you've made. And they build something that says, no, this will stand. Those words would echo in Isaac's mind for the rest of his life. In 1826, the railroad company sold Isaac to settle debts. He was purchased by a cotton broker in New Orleans, who used him primarily as a teamster and general laborer. It was degrading work for someone with Isaac's knowledge, but he endured it with quiet determination. In New Orleans, he encountered something he'd never seen before: free black engineers and craftsmen. The city's complex legal history, with its French and Spanish influences, had created space for a small community of skilled black professionals. Isaac met them in church, in markets, in brief conversations that had to remain careful and vague. They shared knowledge when they could, books passed in wrapped packages, mathematical problems worked out on scraps of paper, whispered discussions of the latest developments in bridge construction and foundation engineering. Isaac learned about the work of Jean-Baptiste Leblanc, a free black engineer who designed levees that still protected parts of the city. He studied drawings of bridge systems from France and England, trying to understand why certain designs succeeded while others failed. For 6 years, Isaac lived in that strange liminal space, enslaved but educated, powerless but brilliant. He began developing his own theories about engineering, particularly focused on the challenges of building in flood-prone areas. The Mississippi River, with its seasonal violence and unpredictable behavior, taught him lessons that no book could provide. He learned to read water the way other men read newspapers, understanding its moods and intentions, predicting where it would go and what it would destroy. Then in 1832, the cotton broker who owned Isaac lost everything in a bad speculation. Isaac was sold again, this time to a slave trader who marched a cough of 32 people west toward Texas. It took 40 days to reach Robertson County, where Colonel Edmund Pierce was looking to expand his labor force. Pierce paid $800 for Isaac. In his ledger, he noted, Negro male, age 24, good health, literate, useful for record-keeping, some mechanical aptitude. It was the understatement of the century. For the first 2 years on Pierce's plantation, Isaac worked in the fields. It was brutal, mindless labor that wasted his abilities, but Pierce hadn't purchased him for his engineering knowledge. Pierce didn't even know Isaac possessed such knowledge. To Pierce, Isaac was just another strong back, another unit of labor to be deployed as needed. The change came in the spring of 1835, when Pierce won his first state contract to build a road connecting the county seat to a neighboring settlement 15 mi away. It was a modest project, but the payment was substantial, and Pierce saw it as an opportunity to establish himself as a contractor. There was just one problem. Pierce had no idea how to build a road. His initial plan was simple. Hire an engineer from Houston, have that engineer create the plans and oversee construction, and pay him a percentage of the contract value. But when Pierce contacted several engineering firms, their quotes shocked him. The engineer's fees alone would consume nearly half his profit. Pierce began asking around the county for cheaper alternatives. Someone mentioned that his slave Isaac could read and write and had once worked on a railroad. Perhaps Isaac could assist with record-keeping for the project. That conversation changed both their lives. Pierce summoned Isaac to the main house, the first time Isaac had been inside it. The colonel explained the project, showing Isaac the crude map he'd drawn of the proposed route. "I need someone who can keep track of materials, maintain records of work completed, that sort of thing," Pierce said. "The foreman tells me you can read." "Is that true?" "Yes, sir." Isaac replied carefully, "Good. I'm going to save myself some money on engineering fees. I'll handle the technical aspects myself." Pierce gestured at a stack of surveying equipment and engineering manuals he'd purchased. "These books explain everything. It can't be that complicated, but I'll need help with the documentation." "Can you handle that?" Isaac looked at the book's volumes. He would have sacrificed almost anything to access. He looked at the surveying equipment, the measuring chains, the levels. He looked at Pierce, whose ignorance was so profound, he didn't even know what questions to ask. "Yes, sir," Isaac said. "I can handle that." Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Pierce would attempt to read the engineering manuals, become frustrated by the mathematics and technical terminology, and eventually hand the books to Isaac with instructions to figure out what this means and explain it to me simply. Isaac would study the books overnight, work through the calculations, and then present the information to Pierce in simplified form. But Pierce's attention span for technical details was limited. He grew impatient with explanations. He wanted results, not lectures. Gradually, Isaac found himself doing more than just explaining. He was solving the problems himself, then presenting solutions in a way that allowed Pierce to believe he'd understood and approved them. The road project succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. It was completed 3 weeks early and came in under budget. More importantly, it didn't wash out during the first rain season, a fate that had befallen many hastily constructed Texas roads. Pierce's reputation grew. So did his ambitions. More contracts followed. A bridge over a small creek, a foundation for a cotton warehouse, a drainage system for a flooded section of farmland. Each project was officially designed and supervised by Colonel Edmund Pierce. Each project was actually engineered by Isaac Brown, working by candle light in his tiny cabin, translating complex problems into elegant solutions. Pierce understood what was happening. Of course, he wasn't stupid, just uneducated and unscrupulous. He realized that Isaac possessed skills far beyond simple literacy. But acknowledging this truth, admitting that his enslaved laborer was the actual engineer, would undermine everything Pierce was building. It would destroy his reputation, invalidate his contracts, and eliminate his income. So instead, Pierce created a system. Isaac would be given increasingly complex projects to solve. He would work out the designs, the calculations, the construction plans. Then Pierce would present them as his own work, claiming credit for the genius that emerged from that small cabin with the locked door. Isaac was given certain privileges in exchange for his silence. Silence that wasn't really a choice, since resistance would mean being sold, beaten, or worse. He received better food than the field workers. He was allowed to keep his candles for night work. He was given access to any books or technical materials Pierce could acquire. He was occasionally permitted to visit construction sites to inspect the work on Pierce's behalf, though he had to pretend to be merely carrying messages rather than actually assessing structural integrity. It was a devil's bargain, made worse by the fact that only one party had any choice in the matter. For 7 years, this arrangement continued. Pierce's reputation as a builder grew across central Texas. He was invited to join the Masonic Lodge. He was consulted on engineering matters by other plantation owners. He was appointed to a state commission on infrastructure development, and Isaac Brown remained property. His genius buried in ledgers that listed him between entries for farming equipment and livestock. Then, in the winter of 1842, the state announced its most ambitious infrastructure project to date: a permanent bridge across the Brazos River at the county line, replacing the dangerous and unreliable ferry that had claimed dozens of lives. The contract would be worth $15,000, a fortune. The engineering requirements would be unlike anything Pierce had attempted before. The Brazos River was not like the small creeks Isaac had bridged before. It was a powerful, temperamental waterway that swelled unpredictably with spring rains and autumn storms. Previous bridge attempts had failed catastrophically. The river's bed shifted seasonally. Flooding could raise water levels by 20 ft in a matter of hours. Any structure would have to withstand not just normal flow, but the violent force of floodwaters carrying debris. Entire trees, sometimes even buildings, torn from their foundations upstream. Pierce submitted his bid with characteristic confidence. He won the contract in March of 1843. Then he brought the engineering requirements to Isaac and said something he'd never said before: "I don't know if this is even possible." Isaac took the documents back to his cabin and studied them for 3 days. He analyzed the river's behavior patterns based on 15 years of flood records. He calculated load requirements, accounting for both the weight of traffic and the impact forces of flood debris. He considered dozens of potential designs, rejecting each one as he identified fatal flaws. Finally, on the 4th night, he had it: not just a design, but an innovation. A system of arched supports that would not only bear weight more efficiently than traditional straight trusses, but would also channel floodwaters in a way that reduced stress on the foundations. The arches would rise high enough to remain above all but the most catastrophic floods, and the foundation piers would be oriented to split the current, reducing the scouring effect that had undermined previous structures. It was brilliant, it was revolutionary, it would work. Isaac prepared detailed drawings and calculations, documenting everything with meticulous care. He'd learned over the years to create 2 sets of plans for every project: one simplified version for Pierce to present, and one complete technical documentation for himself. These complete plans he kept hidden, tucked between the floorboards of his cabin underneath the dirt. He told himself it was just caution, a way to remember the details if Pierce misunderstood something. But it was more than that. Those hidden plans were proof that he existed, that he could think and create and solve problems that defeated educated men. Proof that he was more than property, more than a tool, more than an extension of someone else's will. Pierce submitted Isaac's design to the state engineers under his own name. There was some skepticism. The arch design was unusual, and the foundation approach was unconventional, but Pierce's track record was strong, and his political connections were stronger. The state approved the design and released the first payment. Construction began in April of 1843. It would take 6 years to complete. During those 6 years, Isaac Brown lived in a state of constant tension between creation and eraser. Each day brought the satisfaction of seeing his design take physical form. Stone carefully shaped and placed, calculations transformed into solid structure, theories tested against the unforgiving reality of physics and weather. Each day also brought the humiliation of watching other men take credit for his work, of being introduced to visiting officials as the colonel's assistant, or sometimes just Pierce's boy, Isaac. The construction site became Isaac's world. Pierce, understanding that the project required genuine expertise, gave Isaac unprecedented freedom to supervise the work directly. Of course, this had to be disguised. Officially, Pierce was the chief engineer, visiting the site several times a week to inspect progress and give orders. In practice, Isaac was there every day, though his instructions had to be conveyed through intermediaries or disguised as suggestions that Pierce would then repeat as his own ideas. The workforce consisted of roughly 40 men. Enslaved laborers borrowed from various plantations in exchange for shares of the contract payment, plus a dozen hired Irish and German immigrants who possessed skilled trades like stonemasonry and ironwork. The arrangement created a strange dynamic. The white craftsman initially resented taking direction from an enslaved man, even indirect direction, but Isaac's competence was undeniable. When his solutions worked, when a foundation held firm where they'd expected it to fail, when his calculations proved exact, when his innovations solved problems that had stumped them, respect gradually replaced resentment. One of these craftsmen, a German stonemason named August Brenner, became as close to a friend as the circumstances allowed. Brenner was in his 50s, a widower who'd left Germany after the failed revolutions of the 1830s. He trained in cathedral construction and brought old-world knowledge of stonework that complemented Isaac's theoretical understanding. During lunch breaks, when Pierce wasn't present, Brenner and Isaac would discuss the work openly. Brenner would point out properties of different stones which would hold up best against water erosion, which could be shaped more precisely, which were more likely to crack under thermal stress. Isaac would explain his calculations, walking Brenner through the mathematics that determined arch curves and pier dimensions. This design, Brenner said one afternoon as they examined the first completed arch, "It is remarkable the way the forces distribute. I have seen nothing like it, even in the old bridges in Bavaria." Where did the colonel learn this? Isaac didn't answer immediately. He knew the safe response. The colonel studies extensively, sir. He consults many books. But something in Brina's question, a certain knowing tone, suggested the German already suspected the truth. He must be a very gifted student, Brina said carefully, to surpass what most men learn in years of formal training. The colonel, Isaac replied with equal care, is fortunate to have access to good resources. Brenner nodded slowly. Yes, resources, that is one word for it. They didn't speak of it again directly. But after that conversation, Brenner began directing his technical questions to Isaac when Pierce wasn't around, dropping the pretense that these were casual inquiries. Other workers noticed and followed suit. A quiet understanding emerged. Pierce was the official authority, but Isaac was the actual engineer. This arrangement worked for 4 years. The bridge rose slowly, stone by stone, arch by arch. It survived 2 major floods that swept away the temporary coffer dams Isaac had designed to protect the foundation work. Each time the foundations held exactly as Isaac had calculated they would, and work resumed with renewed confidence. Pierce's reputation grew with each visible sign of progress. He was elected to the state legislature. He was courted by investors wanting to fund larger projects. He gave public speeches about the importance of infrastructure to Texas's future, speaking with eloquent confidence about engineering principles he barely understood. And Isaac remained in his cabin, working by candlelight, solving problems and creating solutions that others claimed as their own. The darkness in this arrangement went beyond simple injustice. There was a psychological dimension that aided Isaac in ways that physical labor never had. In the fields, the oppression was clear and direct. You were property, you worked, you suffered. But at least the situation was honest in its brutality. There was no pretense, but this was different. Isaac was being forced to participate in his own erasure. His mind, the very essence of who he was being stolen piece by piece. Every time Pierce presented one of Isaac's designs, every time someone praised the colonel's engineering brilliance, every time Isaac had to remain silent or even assist in promoting the lie, a part of him was taken. He began having dreams about the bridge. In these dreams, he would stand beneath the completed arches and shout his name, trying to make people understand that he had built this. That it was his mind, and his work that held the stones in place. But in the dreams, no sound would come from his mouth. Or worse, the sounds would emerge, but no one would hear them. People would walk past him as if he were invisible, praising Colonel Pierce's genius, while Isaac screamed silently beside them. He would wake from these dreams in the dark cabin, his heart racing and lie still listening to the sounds of the plantation at night. Sometimes he would hear other people in nearby cabins, muted conversations, a child crying, someone coughing. Occasionally, he would hear something from the main house, laughter from one of Pierce's dinner parties, the sound of music. Two worlds existing in the same physical space, but separated by an unbridgeable gulf. The first signs that something was wrong came in the winter of 1847, 2 years before the bridge's scheduled completion. By this point, the structure was largely finished. All the arches were in place. The roaded was being prepared, and it was clear to everyone that the bridge would not only stand, but would be extraordinary. Pierce's wealth and status had grown proportionally. He'd used his earnings from this project and others to expand his plantation to nearly 7,000 acres. He'd built a new mansion, a grand Greek revival structure that towered over the countryside. He'd married the daughter of a Louisiana senator. He was being mentioned as a possible candidate for governor. But with greater prominence came greater scrutiny, and with scrutiny came questions. Engineers from other parts of Texas and from Louisiana began visiting the bridge site to study its design. Some of these engineers were sophisticated men with formal training from European universities. They examined the structure with increasing puzzlement. This arch system, one engineer from New Orleans commented to Pierce during a site visit, "It's quite innovative. I don't recognize the design principle." "What's your theoretical basis for the curve calculations?" Pierce, caught off guard, attempted to bluff his way through an explanation using terminology he'd memorized from Isaac's notes, but his answer was incoherent. Mixing concepts that didn't belong together. The engineer's eyebrows rose. "I see. And the foundation system, this approach to splitting the current. Where did you encounter that method?" "My own development," Pierce said quickly. "Based on observation of the river's behavior." "Fascinating." The engineer's tone suggested he found it fascinating in the way one finds an obvious lie. "Fascinating. I'd love to see your calculations." "Would you have documentation of your design process?" Pierce felt the ground shifting beneath him. "The paperwork is all at my home, quite extensive." "I'd be happy to show you sometime, but it's rather technical." "I'm an engineer," the man interrupted dryly. "I think I can manage technical documentation." That evening, Pierce came to Isaac's cabin in a state of barely controlled anger. "These people are asking questions, detailed technical questions. I need complete documentation of every aspect of the design. All your calculations, all your drawings, everything. And I need you to prepare notes that will help me answer their questions." Isaac looked at him steadily. "The plans I've given you already include all essential information. It's not enough," Pierce snapped. "They want to know theory, methodology, the thinking behind each decision. I need you to write that out in a way I can study and explain." For the first time, Isaac pushed back. "Colonel, if you study what I write, you'll be able to answer their questions, but you'll never truly understand it the way they want you to. These are educated men. They can tell when someone is repeating memorized answers rather than speaking from knowledge." Pierce's face re-ended. "Are you suggesting I'm not intelligent enough to understand your work?" "I'm suggesting," Isaac said carefully, "that understanding comes from years of study and practice. You haven't had those years. Neither of us can change that now." The two men stared at each other. It was the closest Isaac had ever come to openly acknowledging the truth between them. Pierce recognized the implicit challenge, and something shifted in his expression, fear mixing with anger. "You forget yourself," Pierce said coldly. "You forget what you are and what I own. I own your hands, I own your back, I own whatever comes out of your head. And if you've forgotten that, I can remind you in ways you won't enjoy." Isaac said nothing. The moment passed. The power dynamic reasserted itself, but both men knew something had changed. Pierce got his documentation. Isaac spent the next month creating detailed explanations of every aspect of the bridge's design. Writing in the simplified language, Pierce would need to sound knowledgeable, without revealing the depths of his ignorance. Pierce studied these notes obsessively, practicing explanations in front of a mirror, drilling himself on terminology. It worked mostly. Pierce managed to satisfy the curious engineers, though some remained skeptical. Rumors began circulating in professional circles about the unusual nature of Pierce's knowledge. Technically proficient when discussing the Brazos Bridge specifically, but oddly unable to discuss general engineering principles. One engineer, a methodical man from Virginia named Thomas Hensley, became particularly interested. Hensley had been hired by a private railroad company to survey potential routes through central Texas, and he'd made a point of studying the Brazos Bridge as an example of regional engineering. But the more he studied it, the less sense it made. The design is too sophisticated, Hensley told a colleague, too innovative. The mathematical principles underlying those arch calculations. I've seen similar work in European journals, but nothing published in America. Where would a plantation owner from Georgia have encountered these concepts? Hensley began asking questions around Robertson County. He learned that Pierce had no formal engineering education. He learned that Pierce's early projects had been simple, even crude. He learned that the dramatic improvement in Pierce's capabilities seemed to correlate with his purchase of slaves in 1832. But that seemed like a mad thought. Surely no one would suggest an enslaved person could possess such knowledge. Still, Hensley was thorough. During a visit to Pierce's plantation on a pretext of discussing a potential project, he managed to speak briefly with Isaac, who was summoned to bring Pierce some documents. "You're Isaac Brown?" Hensley asked casually. "Yes, sir. The colonel tells me you assist with his record-keeping. You must have learned quite a bit about engineering by proximity." Isaac recognized the probe instantly. "I help maintain records as instructed, sir. The colonel is generous in explaining his work when time permits." "I see. And what do you think of the bridge?" "You must have observed its construction. It's a fine structure, sir. The colonel's design is very sound." "Yes," Hensley said slowly, studying Isaac's face. "The colonel's design. Quite remarkable for someone with no formal training, wouldn't you say?" Isaac met his eyes without expression. "The colonel reads extensively, sir, and he has a natural talent." Hensley nodded, but his skepticism was obvious. He left the plantation without proof, but with a growing certainty that something wasn't right. He couldn't prove Pierce was a fraud. He had no evidence, and the social realities of 1840s Texas made certain accusations unthinkable. Still, Hensley began quietly sharing his suspicions with other engineers. The whisper campaign was subtle but damaging. Pierce's new projects became harder to secure. Investors grew cautious. Fellow contractors began to watch him more carefully, comparing his claims to his demonstrated abilities. Pierce blamed Isaac, though the logic was twisted. If Isaac hadn't been so talented, Pierce reasoned, the work wouldn't have attracted such intense scrutiny. If the bridge had been merely adequate instead of extraordinary, no one would have questioned it. The colonel's resentment grew, fed by fear that his elaborate fiction would collapse. He began drinking more heavily. He started making mistakes in his business dealings. His political career stalled as opponents began questioning his qualifications. Everything Pierce had built on Isaac's stolen genius began to crack. And Isaac, watching this slow collapse from his small cabin, felt a dark satisfaction mixed with dread. He knew Pierce was dangerous when threatened. He knew enslaved people had been sold, beaten, or killed for far less than the implicit challenge Isaac represented. The question wasn't if Pierce would turn on him. The question was when and how brutal it would be. The break came in the spring of 1848, 1 year before the bridge's completion. By this point, the structure was functionally finished. Traffic could cross it safely. Only final details remained: railings, approach, road improvements, official inspections. Pierce had already received most of the contract payment. The state engineers had praised the work. Success seemed complete, but Pierce was falling apart. The whisper campaign about his credentials had intensified. A rival contractor, jealous of Pierce's success, had begun openly mocking him at political gatherings, asking pointed questions about engineering theory that Pierce couldn't answer. The state had announced its next major project, a bridge even larger than the Brazos crossing, and Pierce's bid had been rejected in favor of a competitor who possessed actual engineering credentials. Pierce's drinking became problematic. He missed business meetings. He became erratic and paranoid, convinced that enemies were plotting against him. His wife, discovering the extent of their financial problems, Pierce had spent lavishly based on expected future contracts that never materialized, left for Louisiana with their daughter. The plantation began to suffer from neglect. Fields went unplanted. Enslaved workers went hungry as Pierce failed to arrange adequate provisions. His overseer, disgusted by the chaos, quit. Pierce tried to manage things himself but had no aptitude for it. The property that had once been prosperous began its slow slide toward ruin. Through all this, Isaac continued his work. The bridge still needed completion. Pierce, despite everything, still needed Isaac's expertise to finish what they'd started, but their interactions became increasingly hostile. Pierce would arrive at Isaac's cabin late at night, drunk and angry, demanding to know why things were falling apart. As if Isaac were somehow responsible for Pierce's inability to maintain the lies he'd built his life on. "This is your fault," Pierce said during one of these midnight visits, swaying in the doorway. "You made that bridge too good, too impressive. If you'd just done adequate work, no one would have questioned it. But you had to show off, didn't you? Had to demonstrate how clever you are." Isaac, sitting at his small work where he'd been reviewing the final inspection documents, looked up calmly. "I built what you asked for, a bridge that would last, a bridge that would stand." "You built a trap," Pierce spat, "a trap for both of us, because now they're asking questions I can't answer, and if they dig deep enough, they'll figure out the truth, and you know what happens then." Isaac knew. If the truth emerged, if anyone proved that enslaved labor had provided not just the muscle, but the mind behind Pierce's contracts, every project would be questioned. Payments might be clawed back. Pierce would be ruined and disgraced. But Isaac would be sold, probably to someone far worse than Pierce, and his knowledge would be wasted in fields or factories. They were locked together in a prison of Pierce's making, and both men knew it. "No one will prove anything," Isaac said quietly. "As long as the documentation says you designed the bridge, that's what history will record. All evidence supports your claim. Except you," Pierce said. "You're the evidence. You're the one person who knows the truth." The implication hung in the air between them. Isaac felt his heartbeat accelerate, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm property, sir." "Property doesn't testify. Property doesn't speak except when spoken to. I'm no threat to you." Pierce studied him through alcohol-dulled eyes, trying to assess whether Isaac was offering reassurance or veiled defiance. Finally, he turned and stumbled away into the night, leaving Isaac alone with the documents and the terrible certainty that Pierce had begun considering permanent solutions to his problem. If you're getting chills listening to this, I need you to share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our work uncovering these forgotten stories, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss content like this. Because what happens next in Isaac Brown's story is darker than you might imagine. Let's continue. Over the following months, Isaac began to understand that his life was in danger. Pierce's paranoia was escalating, and Isaac had seen enough of the plantation's brutality to know what happened to people who became inconvenient. Isaac started taking precautions. He made additional copies of his complete bridge plans, hiding them in different locations. One set buried in an oil-skinned packet near the bridge site. Another concealed in the wall of the workers' privy. A third given to August Brenner with instructions to keep them safe in case something happens. He didn't explain what that meant, but Brenner understood. "You are in danger," Brenner said when Isaac handed him the plans. It wasn't a question. "The bridge is almost complete," Isaac replied. "After that, the colonel won't need me anymore, and he cannot risk you speaking to anyone about how it was truly designed." Isaac nodded. Brenner studied him, clearly wrestling with something. "I could speak up," he said finally. "I could tell people what I have observed, that you are the actual engineer." "No," Isaac's response was immediate and firm. "That would only make things worse for both of us. Right now, there are only suspicions. If someone tried to prove it, the colonel would make sure there was no evidence. He would make sure I was gone before anyone could question me. So what will you do?" "Finish the bridge," Isaac said. After that, he trailed off, not knowing himself what came after. Run, hide. Hope Pierce's fear would subside once the final inspections were complete, and there were no more questions to answer. The final inspections were scheduled for June of 1849. State engineers would examine every aspect of the structure, test its load capacity, and issue their official certification. After that, Pierce would receive his final payment, $3,000, enough to temporarily solve his financial problems, and the project would be complete. As the inspection date approached, something unexpected happened. Thomas Hensley, the Virginia engineer who'd been skeptical of Pierce's credentials, was appointed as the lead inspector. Pierce received this news with visible horror. Hensley would examine the bridge with expert eyes. He would ask detailed questions. If Pierce stumbled in his explanations, if he revealed the shallow nature of his understanding, Hensley would include concerns in his official report. Pierce became frantic. He demanded that Isaac prepare even more extensive notes, coach him more thoroughly. They spent hours in Pierce's study, a strange reversal of the normal order with an enslaved man trying to educate an owner who was too frightened to care about the social transgression. But teaching someone to fake deep expertise is impossible, especially when that person is drunk, desperate, and fundamentally incapable of understanding the material. Pierce couldn't learn in weeks what Isaac had spent years developing. His explanations sounded rehearsed because they were rehearsed. His knowledge was all surface with no depth. The night before the inspection, Pierce came to a terrible decision. He told Isaac there had been a change of plans. Isaac would not be present during the inspection. Instead, he was being sent to Houston with a load of cotton. The timing was suspicious, but Isaac had no choice. He was to leave at dawn. But Isaac had learned to read men as carefully as he read engineering texts. He saw something in Pierce's eyes that night, something beyond fear or anger. A calculation, a decision. Isaac didn't sleep. He lay in his cabin, listening to the night sounds, trying to decide what to do. Just before dawn, he heard footsteps, multiple people trying to move quietly. He recognized Pierce's voice, hushed and urgent, and another voice he didn't recognize. Isaac slipped out through a gap in the back wall of his cabin, a weakness in the construction he'd never mentioned to anyone. He moved silently through the pre-dawn darkness, hiding in the woods behind the slave quarters. From that position, he watched as Pierce and two men he didn't know, rough-looking men probably hired from one of the river towns, entered his cabin. They emerged minutes later, clearly frustrated not to find him. Pierce's face was visible in the growing light, twisted with rage and fear. The three men stood talking in low voices. Isaac couldn't hear their words, but their intentions were clear enough. Pierce was planning to kill him or have him killed, which amounted to the same thing. The hired men would probably claim Isaac had tried to run away and had to be stopped. Or maybe there would be an accident on the road to Houston. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that Pierce had decided the only way to protect his secret was to eliminate the one person who knew it. Isaac made his decision in that moment. He would run. It was June of 1849, and Texas was full of places a man could disappear. If he was willing to abandon everything, risk everything for the chance at survival. He had one advantage. He knew the land. Years of surveying and construction work had taught him every road, every river crossing, every isolated farm and settlement. He knew which communities had free black residents who might help. He knew which routes the slave patrols favored and which they avoided. He also had something else. Knowledge. Engineering knowledge that would be valuable anywhere infrastructure was being built. If he could reach a free state or Mexico, or even a sympathetic community in a remote part of Texas, his abilities might buy him protection, or at least the chance to survive. Isaac moved carefully through the woods, putting distance between himself and the plantation. He had no food, no money, no supplies except the clothes he wore and the knowledge in his head. Behind him, he heard shouting as Pierce realized Isaac had fled. Within hours, the alarm would be raised, patrols would be organized, bloodhounds might be brought in. But Isaac had one more thing in his favor: the bridge. He knew its construction better than anyone alive. He knew its hidden spaces, the gaps in the stonework where a man could hide, the approach areas where sight lines were blocked. If he could reach it before the patrols caught him, he might be able to shelter there long enough to plan his next move. It took him most of the day to reach the bridge, moving through terrain he'd surveyed years before. He arrived as the sun was setting, exhausted and terrified but alive. The bridge stood before him. Hundreds of tons of stone held together by his calculations, his understanding of forces and stresses, his genius that the world would never acknowledge. He climbed down into the structure's interior spaces, areas that existed between the decorative outer stones and the structural inner supports. Here in the dark, hollow places of his own creation, Isaac Brown hid from the world that wanted to erase him. Isaac remained hidden in the bridge for 3 days. He had access to water from the river and could move through the structure's internal spaces to avoid detection. Patrols searched the area repeatedly, but they were looking for a man running, not a man hiding inside the very structure they stood on. From his hiding place, Isaac could hear fragments of conversation as searchers passed overhead. Pierce was offering a reward for Isaac's capture. The story being circulated was that Isaac had stolen items from the plantation and run away. There was no mention of the real reason for his flight. On the second day, Isaac heard something that chilled him. The state inspection was proceeding as scheduled despite the unfortunate situation with the runaway. Pierce was going ahead with the final certification, gambling that his rehearsed explanations would be sufficient. From his hiding place inside the bridge, Isaac listened as Hensley and his team examined the structure. He heard them praising the workmanship, marveling at the precision, discussing the innovative design elements. He heard Pierce accepting their compliments with false modesty. Then he heard something that changed everything. "Colonel Pierce," Hensley said, his voice carrying clearly through the stone passages, "I must tell you I had my doubts about your capabilities. The design of this bridge is so sophisticated, so far beyond what I'd expect from someone with your background that I suspected. Well, it doesn't matter now what I suspected. This inspection has proven me wrong. The engineering here is brilliant, and everything confirms you as its author." Isaac, crouched in the darkness, felt something break inside him. Hensley, the one man who'd questioned the deception, was now validating it. The bridge itself, Isaac's finest work, the physical proof of his genius, was being used as evidence that Pierce was the engineer. In that moment, Isaac understood the full scope of his erasure. It wasn't enough that his labor was stolen, his knowledge appropriated, his identity reduced to property in a ledger. Now his own creation was being used to seal the lie that would define history's understanding of who built it. He emerged from his hiding place that night when the patrols had moved on, and the bridge was deserted. He stood on the structure he'd designed, looking at the stonework that embodied years of his thought and calculation. The moon was bright enough to see every detail. The curve of the arches, the precise placement of the keystones, the drainage channels that would carry away floodwaters, the foundations that would stand for centuries. It was beautiful. It was permanent, and it would forever be credited to someone else. Isaac heard horses in the distance, another patrol making rounds. He had to move, had to decide what to do next. He could continue running, try to reach Mexico or a free state. He could turn himself in and return to whatever punishment Pierce devised. Or he could do something else, something that had been forming in his mind during those 3 days of hiding in the darkness. He could tell the truth, not to Pierce or to the authorities or to anyone who would dismiss his words because of what he was, but he could tell it in a way that might survive. That might someday be discovered. Isaac descended back into the bridge's interior. In one of the hollow spaces behind the decorative stonework, in a place that would be invisible unless the bridge was dismantled, he found a section of soft limestone. Using a broken piece of harder stone, he began to carve. It took hours. His hands were bleeding by the time he finished, and dawn was approaching. But there, hidden in the heart of the structure, were the words that told his truth. Designed and built by Isaac Brown, slave to E. Pierce, year 1843-1849. The Lord knows what men deny. Below this, he carved mathematical notations, formulas specific to the bridge's design, calculations that only the actual engineer would know. Anyone who found this inscription and understood engineering would know it wasn't a fantasy or a fake. It was proof, hidden but permanent, carved into the very substance of his creation. He also carved something else. Full plans buried 40 paces due west of the North Foundation, 3 ft deep. This was partly true. He had buried one set of plans there, but it was also an act of hope. If someone someday doubted Pierce's authorship, if someone investigated carefully enough to find the hidden inscription, they would have a way to verify the truth. Isaac climbed out of the bridge just as the sun was rising. He was exhausted, bleeding, and out of options. He could see a patrol riding toward the bridge from the east. There was no time to run, no place left to hide. He stood in the center of the bridge on the roadway he designed and waited. The patrol reached him within minutes. The lead rider was the Robertson County Sheriff, a man named Davies who knew Isaac by sight. "Isaac Brown," Davies said, "you've led us quite a chase. Colonel Pierce is very anxious to see you returned." "I'm sure he is," Isaac replied quietly. "Why'd you run? The colonel says you stole from him, but that doesn't seem like your character." Isaac looked at the sheriff steadily. "Did the colonel tell you who designed this bridge?" Davies looked confused by the question. "Colonel Pierce designed it. Everyone knows that." "Yes," Isaac said, "everyone knows that." He offered no resistance as they bound his wrists and led him away from the bridge that bore no trace of his name. Isaac was returned to Pierce's plantation that afternoon. The colonel was waiting, his face a mask of relief and rage. The sheriff and his men left Isaac in Pierce's custody, accepting the plantation owner's explanation that this was a matter of internal discipline. What happened over the next several days exists only in fragments of documentation, medical records, letters, later testimonies. What is known for certain is this: Isaac Brown was never seen alive again. The official story was that he died of fever 3 weeks later, a common enough occurrence that it raised no suspicions. He was buried in the unmarked section of the plantation cemetery reserved for enslaved people. Pierce received his final payment for the bridge. The structure was officially certified and opened to great fanfare. Pierce's name was carved into the dedication plaque as chief engineer and builder. The governor attended the ceremony, but Pierce's victory was hollow. His financial situation continued to deteriorate. His reputation never fully recovered from the whispers about his credentials. Other major contracts eluded him. He died in 1867, shortly after the Civil War's end destroyed what remained of his wealth. His name mentioned in newspaper obituaries primarily for his work on the Pierce Bridge as it became known locally. The bridge itself stood. It survived the floods Pierce had feared exactly as Isaac had calculated it would. It survived the Civil War. It survived decades of heavy use and minimal maintenance. It survived into the 20th century when automobiles replaced wagons and modern engineers studied it with amazement. In 1923, a team of engineers examining the bridge in preparation for renovation work made an unusual discovery. While inspecting the interior support structure, they found carved text hidden in one of the hollow spaces. The inscription was weathered but legible, designed and built by Isaac Brown, slave to E. Pierce, year 1843, 1849. "The Lord knows what men deny." Below this were mathematical formulas and a note about buried plans. A careful excavation 40 paces due west of the North Foundation 3 ft deep uncovered an oil skin packet containing detailed engineering drawings and calculations. The papers were signed Isaac Brown and dated throughout the construction period from 1843 to 1849. The discovery created a minor sensation in engineering circles. The sophistication of the drawings, the precision of the calculations, the clarity of the technical explanations, all of it confirmed that their author possessed genuine engineering genius. Comparisons with documented examples of Pierce's handwriting and technical knowledge made it clear that Pierce could not have produced these documents. Further investigation revealed the broader pattern. Pierce's documented engineering work before 1832, before he purchased Isaac, was crude and basic. His work between 1832 and 1849, while Isaac was his property, showed brilliant innovation. His work after 1849, after Isaac's death, returned to mediocrity before ceasing altogether. The evidence was overwhelming. Isaac Brown had been the engineer, Pierce had been a thief, but this revelation came 74 years too late to matter to the man who'd suffered the theft. Isaac Brown died without recognition, without freedom, without even a marked grave. His genius had been buried twice, once by the system that enslaved him, once by the man who exploited him. The bridge was eventually renamed the Brown-Pierce Bridge. In a belated gesture of recognition, a small historical marker was placed noting Isaac Brown's role in its design. But for more than 7 decades, everyone who crossed that structure believed they were traveling on the work of Colonel Edmund Pierce. They had no idea they were being supported by the genius of a man whose name had been deliberately erased from history. Today, engineers who study the bridge speak of Isaac Brown with reverence. His design innovations were decades ahead of their time. Elements of his water management system and arch support methodology have been found in later bridges designed by famous engineers. Men who likely saw the Brazos Bridge and learned from its techniques without ever knowing who actually created them. But what remains most remarkable about the bridge isn't its technical achievement. Impressive as that is, what remains remarkable is what it represents. How genius can be stolen, how history can be fabricated, how a man can build something extraordinary and be erased from its story so completely that for nearly a century, no one even thought to question the official narrative. Isaac Brown's bridge still stands more than 170 years after its completion. It no longer carries traffic. It was closed to vehicles in 1957 and now exists as a historical structure, but it remains solid. The stones still perfectly placed, the arches still holding their precise curves, the foundations still splitting the current exactly as Isaac calculated they would all those years ago. The bridge stands as both monument and gravestone, a testament to extraordinary achievement and to the terrible injustice that denied its creator recognition for his entire life. It reminds us that the infrastructure we depend on, the systems we take for granted, the very foundations of our civilization, were often built by people whose names were stolen along with their labor. Isaac Brown died in 1849, his genius buried with him, but what he built refused to die. It stands still, solid and permanent, waiting to tell its story to anyone willing to listen carefully enough to hear the truth hidden in its stones. This mystery reveals something profound about American history. How much of what we've built rests on contributions that were deliberately hidden? How many brilliant minds were silenced? How many stories were erased? What do you think about Isaac Brown's story? Do you believe justice was served even 74 years late? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this forgotten history compelling, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the stories history tried to bury. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next.